Evolutionary.org presents Evolutionary Hardcore Podcast with your co-hosts, Steve from the American Underground and Mobster from the UK Iron Den. Get ready for the most hardcore and underground info in the industry. And here we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
Evolutionary.org hardcore podcast coming your way. Episode 122. This time we're doing Chris Cormier, and I've got Stevesmi as myself, and I've got Da Mobster as my Welsh buddy over here. What's up, buddy?
All good. Bit cold. Winter's coming, but we're all good.
Yeah, we are rolling on this, guys. So seasons change. This is it. This is part of the game. So Chris Cormier, let's talk about him. Very interesting story behind him. He's another one of these guys who a lot of consistency over time, a lot of top 5 finishes, and he basically got his pro card back in the early 90s, back when it was hard to get a pro card. Now it's a lot easier. He did 75 plus competitions, winning a dozen of them outright. Top 5 in most of them. His peak stats listed 5'10", 250 pounds shredded. He was a big guy. Not a guy you'd want to piss off if you were in a nightclub, which we're going to get into later, because he did piss someone off in a nightclub before, or they got pissed at him. Depends on your perspective. So listen, his arms, 22 inches, chest listed at 55 inches. And he's got a tiny 22-inch waist. So 22-inch waist, 55-inch arms. You can kind of imagine that. That is a guy with an amazing physique. Born in 1967, he's an American. His nickname is the Real Deal Cormier. So where was he born, guys, before I bring Mobster in? He was born back in Southern California, Palm Springs. That is the home of bodybuilding worldwide, and especially at that time. So that is the place he wanted to be for bodybuilding. He did a lot of sports growing up, but he really got interested in weight training in high school. He was on his weightlifting team. He was competing against the best lifters in his district and blowing them away. So you could tell from a young age he was gifted for bodybuilding and weight training. He was a shy kid. He didn't like being in the spotlight. And that's something even as an adult he took. But he loved to compete on stage. Even if you're a shy person, a lot of shy people do theater and stuff like that. So just because you're a shy person does not mean you're still not going to like to go on stage. That's kind of the way you cope with shyness in a lot of people. You like to you need to get out there and put yourself out there. So he took this seriously. He was doing the NPC Team Nationals in the late 80s. He was winning it. He liked to research, ask questions of the older guys to improve. Years later, 1993, Npc USA Championships, he earned his pro card. He got first place. Now he was ready to take the next step and mess with the guys at the high levels against tougher opponents. So in 1994, he finished second at Ironman Pro. And then he was going on to Mr. Olympia. He ended up besting guys like Ronnie Coleman and Nasser, finishing 6th place that year. What a accomplishment for him. A few years later, 1997, Night of Champions, he won it. He won the Ironman Pro 4 straight years, Australian Grand Prix twice in a row. He also competed at Mr. Olympia in total 10 times. 3rd place in 1999 behind Ronnie Coleman and Flex Wheeler. And then in 2002, 3rd place behind Ronnie Coleman and Kevin Levrone, when we have done podcasts on those guys. So you guys can check them out. So he never got the Mr. Olympia Mobster, but he was very consistent during that time. And we'll talk about what he could have possibly done to win Mr. Olympia. We'll talk about some of his issues off the bodybuilding stage. I'm gonna bring you in, Mobster. Tell us a little bit about what you think about his the way he moved it.
Well, I'll tell you to sort of start with, I had the pleasure many years ago of being of one of probably the only British or English Grand Prix that I attended. And funny enough, I actually got a press pass as a result of knowing who's who and having my little magazine at the time, and saw Chris on stage. So there's a little side story for you. For me, and we addressed this in the pre-show, Chris is one of those guys who should have won at least one Mr. Olympia. And for a lot of guys, including myself, as a bit of a fan back in the day, he was a very big, very powerful guy. And something that was interesting, which I knew from before, but I hadn't considered until we were preparing for the podcast. Back in the day, he was one of the guys that trained in the group. A lot of what happens you see now is with social media, Instagram, etc., is you very rarely see top pro on camera with anybody else. And if you see him with anybody, it's maybe one other person. Whereas Chris was a free ring circus. There was a bit of a thing going on between him, Flex Wheeler, and Rico Clinton. And although Rico never placed in any big competitions, Rico was, to use the parlance that the boys themselves was used, one big nigger. You had Flex Wheeler, that was a potential Mr. Olympia and an Arnold Classic winner himself. And you had Chris Cormier. And there's some clips out there of the banter and looking at girls, checking them out and stuff like that, which they talked about in Chris's documentary with Generation Iron. Real good pals, and not just training partners. They the way that they just talk on the documentary, these are guys that got serious affection. They're brothers for life, etc., kind of vibe. You don't get to see the training group type stuff now. For whatever reason, maybe we become with social media a little bit more selfish, or appear to be a little bit more selfish in that particular way. Whereas these guys that would hang out, eat together, etc. In fact, as you'll recall, Steve, we've done in previous podcasts when we've talked about some of the Arnold era stuff, when the guys would all go out and eat together and hang out together and go clubbing together. And this was Rico and Flex and Cormier were of their ilk. It's not something you see in much modern. In terms of the perception, and this is from other pros, Chris should have won a Mr. Olympia. And the one thing which we got into that seemed to let him down is that he enjoyed socializing, and I'm being very polite, a little bit too much. The American phrase when to party doesn't mean to go out and have a drink with one's friends and maybe dance around someone's front room. Partying seems to be a euphemism for getting high. And they again addressed this in his documentary. Chris was partying before the night before competitions, the night after competitions, train like a demon in the morning and go out and party. And again, I'm using it euphemistically, in the afternoon and in the evening, to the point of stupidity, to the point of where close friends, including Flex and Rico, started to wonder what the hell was going on. That there was a time when, in fact, he actually collapsed at one of these parties and had to be revived by the girlfriend, and just some crazy stuff. So you go, okay, the potential is enormous. Big frame. As a young athlete, he said pretty much every sport that he took up, he got good at. He lived in a kind of tough area, and yet mum and dad were keeping him away from the stupidity. So it's one of those, so much potential, but could he, would he, should he, that kind of situation. Something else that Steve and I discussed, Chris was crazy strong. And in fact, there's a lot of back and forth with Flex Wheeler in articles and again in videos, etc., where they talk about training styles with other athletes. And he said that Chris was one of those guys that you could out-rep him. And Sean Ray talks about it. I could out-rep him, I could out-condition him, but I couldn't out-strength him. There's discussions of 455-pound incline bench, 180-pound dumbbell benches, rows with 180-pound, 200-pound dumbbells, and a bunch of other crazy stuff. So it's definitely the being together was good for the reasons I've already stated, but it was also a driver for these guys. If the training together made them all very good bodybuilders. When you've got a group that includes 2 Arnold Classic winners and 2 guys that potentially could have won the Mr. Olympia, that's a hell of a training group right there, Steve. So yeah, you got that aspect. Something that a lot of videos, articles, etc., don't address too much was that he had a massive rather a bad back injury towards the end of his career. And in fact, the famous Dorian Yates video where he spews up in the rather dirty looking street outside Temple Gym was after he recovered from a neck injury. And perversely, he got that squatting and looking at a pretty girl as she went past and turned his head with his neck under load. And at his back injury, I believe he got something of an abscess and he had to go to hospital and learn to walk. So they got stuff kind of there. What's really nice now, when you see him, is just maintain some of that muscle tissue. He's not a small guy, not 255 pounds. He's obviously shrunk down a little bit, but he still looks like a hefty guy. And what I like now is that there's a lot of pros. He's been over to Oxygen Gym in Kuwait. He's got a lot of pros, and right now he's working with Breon Ainsley for at the time that this video has been recorded. Preps these guys, and when I say prep, it's mostly conditioning and posing. He shows them, he gives them all the little things that you need to know about being on stage. I think Dennis James is a bit like this. Well, they'll give you those last minute, right, listen, you're going to be on stage for half an hour or an hour. We're going to pose you for half an hour or an hour. And all the nuances about being a professional. So this is a guy that knows his stuff and he has that respect in the industry. Peter McGough says the same thing. For all his failings and stupid things that he did, everybody still likes him. He comes across as a real nice, affable guy, a guy that you'd like to train with in the gym, Steve. Yeah, back to you.
Yeah, we're going to kind of get into a story in a minute. So he's been on social media. He did some leg training workouts with Dorian Yates, and we're going to link the article where you can actually look at the video.
Yeah.
He actually trained his legs so hard that he actually threw up. And, we see this a lot when you're eating that much food, it's in your stomach. And if you're training that hard, your heart rate goes up, your body's under stress. Your body's going to say, you know what? How do I correct this stress? How do I relieve this stress? So what it's going to do is it's going to regurgitate. Basically, it's going to expel everything it can out of the body, and it's going to go out one way or the other. So that's why you ever notice you eat a meal before your workout, and then during your workout, you suddenly have to go to the bathroom. Well, that's why. So it's very important not to fill your stomach up with food before a workout, especially a hard workout. You actually don't want anything in your stomach before a hard workout. And also you want to make sure you evacuate before your workout. Sometimes, something would be, it's in there and you're like, yeah, I'm just going to go work out anyway. I kind of got to go, but I'm just going to go work out. No. You want to go beforehand. So, you want to urinate, you want to have a bowel movement before your workout, and you won't end up sick during your workout and ruining your workout. So there's another video of him working out his chest, and you can tell this guy is a big guy. So you definitely want him to be a bouncer because he's very intimidating. Now, I don't know if he can fight being a big bodybuilder, and Mobster and I are going to kind of talk about it in a second, because there was a story, and he outlines it when he did an interview with Rich Piana about how him and Mike Tyson went at it. When you're that big, people think that they can, kind of mess around with you and you're not going to care. So he kind of got into it with Mike Tyson. And Mobster, tell us, you're a very good storyteller. So tell us about that story with Mike Tyson. By the way, guys, Mike Tyson, we did a hardcore about Mike Tyson. That is episode 106, if you guys want to go back and listen to that. But Mobster's going to tell the story about how Chris and Mike almost came to blows.
So there's a couple of versions of this story. I'll try to stick to the main story, as Steve says. Him and Rico apparently both work in the door of a nightclub, one assumes somewhere in California, Los Angeles, whatever. And essentially, Tyson and his entourage, big entourage at that time, as you know, he was going for his $300 million and spunking it, would go out with the guys, and they're in the nightclub, and essentially the guys, they've all had a drink, they're fooling around, and it's a little bit, you get this a lot in nightclubs, look at that bouncer, I wonder if I could take him, that kind of vibe. Mike Tyson's a heavyweight champion of the world. He hasn't got nothing to prove, but the guys that are with him, they're joshing. They're saying, Mike should do this, Mike should do that. Look at the size of that fella down the front. He reckons he looks like he could take a blow. He looks like it'd be okay, whatever. And Tyson's taking it all on the chin, as they say, and taking it with amusing or whatever else. But the long and the short of it is there's a bit of back and forth. And in fact, Rico and Chris both said that there was some not very nice conversations between some of the entourage and the two guys working the door. You know, as if to say, Mike's going to do this and Mike's going to do that. Mike hasn't said nothing. He's just chilling. He's having a drink. He's relaxing, etc. But as they're leaving the nightclub, there's Rico hears something, Chris hears something, and at that moment, gets a big clump of hands, like open hand to the back of the neck. What we would say when I was a kid, we used to call these neck slaps. It's like an open-handed blow. It can be quite powerful, and it can knock you about. This is exactly what happened. He's fallen half a step forward, straightened up, turned around as if to say, what the hell? And it's just about to raise hands when you got a goofy smile off of Tyson and say, his buddies are saying, yeah, I knew he could take it. I knew he could take it. And Tyson says, you're a big guy, you can take it. And they leave the club. Now, Chris is all for chasing after and kicking ass, but for some reason they don't get into it. Sense prevails. But as I told Steve, there was a second part to the story which wasn't told in some of these earlier versions. So they get invited one way or another, chasing after the girls as usual, to some party at some person's house. One assumes again somewhere in Vegas, and the entourage is there. Mike's minding his business over in some corner with his close friends, but Chris said there was a situation, shall we be polite, with a few members of the entourage as a way of getting back for the bullshit and this cuff on the back of the head that he'd had to endure at the nightclub. And of course, now he's not working, he doesn't have a worry about losing his job, and there's a little bit of a scuffle. There's a few blows handed out as a reminder, as if to say, don't mess with us, guys. So it was kind of one of those, he tells the story now like it's a Tyson story. It's something we would say you can tell over the dinner table and it can share out there. But one can only wonder, Steve, if these two guys have come to blows, as you said, 255-pound bodybuilder, for the most part, is going to be winded after a couple of minutes. But if 255 pounds that's benching 450 pounds hits you, it could have been a very different kind of story. But as I say, at the time, sense prevails. Now, something you and I discussed, and you said we were talking about this. And there's this thing sometimes when you're trained or in condition or you look kind of strong, even vaguely athletic or whatever, and maybe it's a jealousy thing, and it's kind of like a weird vibe sometimes. But some people, they're uncomfortable. They're intimidated. It's kind of, so you get this stupid stuff that sometimes happens, and I'm sure Steve knows what I'm on about. Go out with a six-pack on the beach, and the guy there is a bit smoother. You know, oh, you take steroids, that's the reason why you're in shape or whatever else. Now, this is okay when you're sober, but when drink is involved, you sometimes get stupid situations. So I was using the analogy, I do not consider myself a fighter, but I've had these kind of conversations. And I said, for me, and I'll ask Steve if he's got any stories like this, I'm that big. If I fall on you, it's going to be a hell of a job dragging me off, and you're probably going to get winded that way. And I've only got to hit you one time. But in terms of actual fighting or whatever else, I don't know. I'd have to weigh about 50 pounds, 60 pounds less than I do right now to be anything like that. But it's kind of weird, you know, just because you've got muscles, people want to fight you, or they want to touch you, they want to punch you, they want to test your strength. And you've gone out for a nice quiet drink with your buddies, maybe with a couple of girls, you're having a meal, and you're having this weird conversation. Has this ever happened to you, Steve? I mean, it's happened to Chris. I can say that it's probably happened to me in terms of the conversation. What about yourself?
I was at a football game in New Orleans one time, and it's packed, packed. One of the craziest places to go to a football game. Not your football, Mobster.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah, I've heard about the stuff after the match.
Not soccer. We're talking about
football. It's just as bad.
Yeah, exactly. But this guy behind me, kept pushing me and messing with me. He was cheering for the same team as me, but he was he was kind of giving me little jabs and stuff from behind. But yeah, so it's the same thing. And I'm like, ooh, why is this guy pushing me and touching me? Every time the team would do good, he'd push me and grab me and stuff. So yeah, it's the same thing, definitely. If I was a skinny guy, a little 130-pound skinny guy, he wouldn't be rough with me like that. So yeah, it's the same thing. And I understand. I think Tyson too was kind of testing. He wanted to test what he could get away with. And kind of, play around with his friends and stuff. So at the end of the day, Mobster and I were kind of debating on who would win if they were actually to get in the fight. And if you read some of the things out there where, people tell about the stories. A lot of people who aren't in fitness and aren't in bodybuilding are like, oh yeah, Mike Tyson would lay that big meathead down in 30 seconds. That meathead wouldn't even be able to go 20 seconds without being out of breath. So, I think that's interesting. I mean, if you put Chris in the ring with Mike for 12 rounds, I don't think Chris would survive very long. I mean, the endurance that you need as a boxer is just amazing. And that's the thing with Mike Tyson. If you listen to our previous podcast with him, that was his problem. He went into some fights in bad shape. So if he didn't knock the guy out right away and he let the guy stick around, then he would get himself into trouble because his conditioning was not good enough. So I think in this situation, if they were to come down the blows, I personally think Mike Tyson at his peak would have basically destroyed him. Like, he would destroy him. There's no way. Even if Chris took a punt, swing at him, whatever, Chris wouldn't have been able to land anything because Mike Tyson would have been able to juke out of the way. So.
Oh yeah.
Now, what do you think, Monster?
I said with Tyson, that's just one of those things. Chris would have to get lucky, the same as what I think I would. I can think of in strongman, there's a guy, I'm funny enough, I was talking to a training buddy just this morning about a fella over here called Jay Patman, and Jay's 120 kilos, probably about 5.5 foot tall, and thick as fuck. He's real big, strong guy, 6-7 plates aside, front squat, etc., etc. But he trains for conditioning. He would be the guy that would surprise you. Most of us, got some athletic ability, but speed. When you talk about Tyson, and I think we covered it in the podcast, I said how analytical he was, that he would sit down and watch these guys' videos and train. So he would break you down. I don't know necessarily with Cormier if it would be that one knockout punch. Chris would have to get lucky with a punch, whereas you got the bobbing and weaving. Even at the exhibition match that Tyson had this weekend, it's bobbing and weaving, moving, ducking, and finding your gaps. You're waving your arms are coming in for that killer blow, and he's hit you 3 times on the rib cage and then walked away or moved out of the way of your punch because he'll see it coming. And this is the thing with Tyson. He, as much as we would say, was built for boxing and built for brutality. His intelligence, and he's actually got better as he's got older. His younger intelligence, youthful intelligence, was all about analyzing how you were throwing, how you were standing, where you were coming from, knowing the way you're gonna punch again. So I think it'd be one of those things where Chris might get one lucky blow in, but Tyson's gonna hit you 3 or 4 times, and he's gonna pound in that rib cage, and he's gonna step away. So Chris would have to get real lucky. Maybe I think that maybe the best thing to come out of this is that Chris probably thought he could, and it's nice to think that way. But getting knocked on your ass has a way of destroying those dreams real quick. And I suspect that would be good for Tyson. He'd be a dream destroyer in this particular case. We're talking a time, I believe he was around his peak. I think he was still knocking out heavyweight. So I wouldn't want to fight. I'd probably prefer to fight him now than I would have then. And again, as I say, I think it's one of those great stories that Chris can sell. The whole thing with the real deal stuff is, of course, that he looked like Evander Holyfield, especially when he was younger. So he looked like a boxer. And maybe he put gloves on when he was younger. But as you and I both know, training to be the kind of bodybuilder that he was at his peak as a bodybuilder is not even close to training to be a great amateur boxer or a great professional boxer. Don't care if you've got a six-pack. I don't care if you've got big muscles. It's very, very rare to see crossover between those two sports without you dropping some weight or training. And I'd want to put a year, minimum 6 months. And even that would just be for a couple of minutes of white-collar boxing. So nice to think that maybe he could get a blow in and maybe take some of the entourage out. But Tyson, no, I don't think so. I'd put money on Tyson to win all day long, especially in those days.
So get into his training, Mobster, and then I'm gonna talk about his nutrition. We're gonna talk more about his leg issues where he had to go to the hospital back in 2016. But first, talk about his training. What'd you come up with his training? Is it the same as most of these other guys?
I'm a big fan. In terms, as I said earlier on, in terms of his strength, he was very inspirational, and he made for some great. I mean, I'm the thing of a few layouts that bodybuilding magazines, the Wheeler magazines had. One is Casey Viator doing some kind of insane training with some buddies, and they're overloading stuff. Chris in the flex stuff when they were able to get these kind of body training sessions into the magazine, they were just amazing photographs. When you got, it's not like now with the spray on stuff and some of the posed fake weights and whatever else. This was with the guys with the sleeves on, ragged shorts and boots on, whatever, and to be crude, 3 big Negro guys, all 250 plus or looking 250 plus, built crazy strong. As I said earlier, on 180-pound dumbbell benches, 200-pound dumbbell rows, 455 on the inclined bench. One of the videos I watched as research for this was one of the stuff that him and Flex are doing. I think they're both running up for a Mr. Olympia competition when they appeared together, and they're training with Charles Glass. And Charles is doing the hands-on stuff where he's getting them, touches his hand where he wants the muscles to tense up against, etc. And they looked kind of weird because they both got their shirts off. So there's a little bit of that for the training stuff where it's been done for the video. I think another one was prepping for one of the what do they call it, Battle for the Olympia videos, which they used to do, and then show you a series of training running up to the last 2 weeks training prep for a Mr. Olympia. There's nothing crazy about their training. There's no 100 rep sets. There's nothing crazy with electrodes or whatever. It's not anything that's overcomplicated. It's all straightforward stuff. But as I just said, done with big weights, food on point, etc., etc. So listen, you're talking about basic flat bench, incline bench, barbells, dumbbells for chest, flies, some pec machine work, rear delt work for shoulders, rows. There's nothing crazy, or it's quite a simple, straightforward approach. But again, with Chris, what you're seeing is what you got. It worked. Naturally athletic, naturally lean, and indeed, that's probably one of his saving graces. Even when he was doing stupid, crazy stuff outside the gym, with getting high and literally spunking away his winnings to the point of stupidity, crashing cars and whatever, his natural athletic ability saved him from looking like a big fat mess on stage. So, I mean, one of the things I'll get, as I mentioned to you in the pre-show, Steve, he was partying the night before big competitions, and even tells us the story himself. So we've seen this video of him training in the morning. Let's say it's a back workout, and it's as good a back workout as any professional bodybuilder. Low cable rows, one arm dumbbell rows, pull downs, all the stuff that you would expect. I said nothing unusual, nothing different. And then getting high in the evening, and then competing the next day or the day after. I mean, if he's making any mistakes, if he's making a mess of his training, he's doing the stuff that we'd all do, and then doing the stupid stuff, almost like kind of messing it up. And in fact, you and I touched on someone else that was doing this kind of crazy stuff between fights when we did the John Jones podcast. I can't understand, Steve, if you're going to work really, really hard in the gym, and let's not muck around. Chris was working really, really hard in the gym. If you're dieting, if you're in the posing room, putting half an hour or an hour posing in, if you're doing all the anabolics and the performance enhancing drugs that this guy needs to do, what the fuck are you doing getting high the night before a competition? What the hell's that about? I don't know. Chris doesn't strike me as a guy that needs to sort of self-destruct. But something else you and I addressed in the pre-show, and if it's a moral in the towel, which I said was a phrase I used earlier on, why do some of our members, forum members included, do this kind of stuff? I can't understand it. If you've done fasting, you got into competition, you've done powerlifting, you know some of the training that I'm on about, how much of a grind some of this stuff is. I'm trying to figure out mentally where Chris was. Was it just because he thought he could get away with it because of his athletic ability, or is it kind of like a self-destructive thing? I don't know. If of the training that I've done in the past, when I've been hanging out my ass in the last few days before a competition, before I rest and recover and go out and lift and do my best, the hell that I would go out doing any kind of partying. What can you figure it out, Steve? What's that all about?
At the end of the day, man, it's a compulsion. It's an addiction. It could be childhood issues. It's just you start doing stuff, alcohol, recreational drugs. These are addictive habits. These are addictive substances. So you start using them, it's hard to get away from them, man. And a lot of people, he uses it before a competition. He's extremely nervous going into the competition. So when you have some type of issue like with nervousness or anxiety, that's when you're going to turn back to your addictions. That's why it's a bad idea to attempt to get rid of an addiction and also bring these types of stresses and anxieties into your life. So you want to, this is why this year with the pandemic in 2020, a lot of people who've been trying to kick addictions have had a very difficult time because they've been under stress. They've been under, all the stress over everything. So, that's why they do it. It's a coping mechanism. So it's a lot of it is psychological. So, we'll get into his nutrition. If it wasn't for all this substance abuse, there's no telling, what he could have done. His genetics are fantastic. Now, when he was eating right, he did eat good. I mean, he doesn't ever talk about, cheating or stuff. So he talks about avoiding sugar. He didn't have any issues with his nutrition itself. He stuck to the typical bodybuilding foods, the eggs, the chicken breast, the steak, the turkey, the fish, the greens, the rice, the potatoes, the oats for his carbs. So carbs, proteins, the good fats, salads, lots of green vegetables. So there wasn't really no evidence of that. I mean, we don't know what he did behind closed doors, but he had a really good diet, obviously. So his issues were substance abuse. So let's talk about some of the things, though, his health issues, his back and legs. Mobster alluded to it earlier. In 2016, they had stiffened up. He had to go to the hospital. He was begging for pain medication on the way to the hospital, and everyone was scared of him because he was a big guy. And you see a guy of that size, you don't know what to make of it. I think a lot of these EMT guys, they get intimidated when they see someone like that. Anyone would get intimidated, but especially someone who's trying to save someone's life. You're seeing a patient. It's kind of like having a brand new luxury car and taking it to the auto mechanic with a problem. The auto mechanic's gonna be like, "What? You've got a problem? You only have 500 miles on this car and you already have problems." Doesn't make any sense. So I think that's what they kind of were intimidated by. The cops were even scared to go near him. He talked about he wasn't able to pee for over a day. They were running many tests and they found out his spine was infected. He was actually close to being paralyzed, supposedly.
Yeah.
He blamed it on a lifting injury from he was 19 years old, squatting, that had gotten worse as he aged. But we know, from Mobster and I have looked at some of these studies on the kidneys, and when you are that size and you're using all the compounds he's listing and you're using these recreational drugs, it puts a huge tax on your kidneys. So kidney issues, it's a domino effect. Once you start having problems with your kidneys, it's going to have a domino effect on the rest of your body. So, let's get into it. We don't have much time left, but we've got about 20 minutes left. So let's talk about steroids. That's what you guys want to know. What was he using at his peak, Mobster? So we can kind of go over the cycle. I'll let Mobster kind of give his thoughts. So in the article I wrote, which we will link, I kind of laid out a cycle that we speculated that he would have used when he was getting second place at Mr. Olympia's, back in, the late 90s, back in 99 and 2002, early 2000, very early 2000s, around the tech boom era, the 99, 2000, 2001, 2002. He got 2 second place finishes at Mr. Olympia. So what was he using? Well, first off, right off the bat, we can assume that he was using HGH. HGH is growth hormone, human growth hormone. And what HGH does is it will go basically produce your cells, get your cells split, get your cells growing inside the body. So it's a must for these guys to get that big. They must use a large amount of HGH day in and day out. And that's very, very important. With the HGH, they're going to need to use insulin because they need to bring back down their blood sugar. If you're not using the insulin with HGH, your blood sugar is going to go sky high. So insulin was also widely used around this time, although I don't mention it in the article. it is kind of like peanut butter and jelly when it comes to the HGH and insulin protocol. So these guys will use the insulin before meals. The reason you use insulin before meals is you create a sponge effect in the body. You inject the insulin, your muscles, your muscle resistance starts to go up. You take the food, you take the shakes, you take your whey, you take the protein, and that sucks up into the muscle, and it allows you to grow bigger and bigger. So the HGH and insulin both together give that synergy, combined with great genetics, combined with the steroids he's using, combined with everything, his nutrition. It works out for him. Now, if you're a regular Joe and you use insulin, you're just going to get fat. You don't have his genetics. You're not taking all this HGH. You don't have your diet dialed in as good as he does. You're not taking all these steroids that he's taking. So it ain't going to work for you, but it works for these guys to get big. Another steroid that has to do with nutrition partitioning is Trenbolone. Trenbolone is the best nutrition partitioner steroid out there of all the main steroids. And bodybuilders around this time, they were using Trenbolone. Bodybuilders of the late 80s and 90s, they were much bigger than the bodybuilders of the 70s and early 80s. Why? Trenbolone was a big reason why. Trenbolone was abused around this time. So we could speculate Mobster, he was using a lot of Trenbolone, a gram or possibly more of the Trenbolone. It is a must. You're not going to be able to compete against your competition without using a lot of Trenbolone. Now, along with the Trenbolone, you were seeing other guys. He might have used some Primobolan, a lot of Primobolan, not some, a lot, maybe 1.5 grams of Primobolan, or he could have used EQ, mild steroid like that, to get it in there and help with protein synthesis and all those other wonderful things that anabolic steroids do. So that's thrown in there. It's a more mild compound. The trend is not mild. The trend is excessively strong. So a mild compound in there is something you would throw in there to not kill yourself pretty much and not feel like crap all the time. And then the testosterone, you know, they used testosterone in this time. 15, 20 years earlier, they did not. But the difference is they had access to aromatase inhibitors in this time. So they could use their 8X, their Letro as their aromatase inhibitor. Aromasin wasn't around yet. Aromasin did not start appearing till later on in the 2000s. So I don't even think it was developed yet in the late 90s. I think it was developed in the mid 2000s. So they would have not been using aromasin. They were probably using Letro. Letro is a very, very strong AI. It's not something you'd want to take on a typical cycle, but for these guys, they took it. It was very, very strong. It nuked the estrogen strong like nothing else. And then ahead of the competitions, Winstrol, Anavar, the drying compounds, maybe even something like Masteron, which is a hardener. Winstrol, 100 milligrams a day, Anavar, 100 milligrams a day, Masteron, a gram a week. And that would provide the hardening effect. So those are the different steroids that we could speculate that he used, and he would use those drying compounds, the hardeners, ahead of the competition. He would cut off the testosterone. If they kind of figured that out. Let's cut off the testosterone early. We don't want it in our system. We don't want to be bloated when we go on stage. Mobster, what do you think? What do you think he did?
I'm looking down the list here. I'm saying Winstrol sure for conditioning. Anavar, I wouldn't be surprised if he actually run that a little bit higher, up to 150 milligrams. That's way more than most people would ever need. And we talk about this on the forums multiple times. 50 milligrams is a sweet spot. But I wouldn't be surprised if he run that a little bit higher for short periods of time, just to maintain the levels of strength that we know that he had. I agree 100% with the testosterone lymphonate. And as Steve said, this is a pre-competition cycle. It would be tweaked and changed in a run up to a competition. So the 1.5 grams a week, I think that's almost certainly a given. You could probably put money on that. The Trenbolone, again, for me, for most guys, a gram a week, especially with everything else, would be way, way too much. But we're talking about a professional level bodybuilder with the genetics he's got. And again, with the 1,500 milligrams of Primo, and as Steve said already, with regards to the HGH and the insulin, I agree again. What I'm actually thinking about that is not included here maybe some Deca for joint relief. Now, we know this is not really a joint repairer as such. You feel better on it. You'll go back to the same problems you got off. But with the weights that he was shifting, Steve, especially pre-competition, I would not be at all surprised. And with that neck injury to consider building up over the years to the point that we talked about earlier on, there'll be maybe some pain relief using Deca. And again, competition, two drugs not mentioned on this list. One would be some sort of diuretic, and bearing in mind what I've just said earlier on with his habit or occasional habit of partying the night before a competition, I can see a reliance here on diuretics to maintain that contest shape. And something else, Chris is quite a well-rounded bodybuilder with a good physique that, as I said earlier on, other pros agreed that in the right place at the right time could have won the Mr. Olympia. However, he suffers from the black man's weakness, and it's not all black men, of course, but from the black man's weakness for poor calves. So maybe, and again, this is pre-competition cycle we're talking about, for competition, maybe escalene or something like that as a site enhancement into the calves. With the delts, the chest, the back, the waist, the thighs that Chris had, his arms, you don't need to put anything in those places, but his calves, he had a little bit of a weakness in the calves. And something else I consider, Stephen, I made notes as you were talking. I'm thinking of Lee Priest and Paul Dillette when these at one point shared an apartment. So I wouldn't be the tiniest bit surprised if the cycle that we're looking at here, and you guys that listening to the podcast can go off and listen to previous podcasts and the articles that we linked to in those podcasts and compare it. Did Chris and Flex and Rico all have similar cycles? I would not be in the tiniest bit surprised if they did. I don't think there'd be any secret between them. They're very close even now. Talk about brothers for life, and getting emotional when they say how Chris nearly died and stuff. So I'm thinking if they were that close together, they're partying together, they're going out on dates together, they're eating together, it'd be one of those things where drugs would probably be, especially performance enhancing drugs, would be open to discuss. And I would not be in the tiniest bit surprised. I wouldn't even be surprised if they helped inject each other. That's that. I've considered that relationship. I'm hell, not something I'm making a habit of, but I've given guys a TRT jab when they've asked me to. So I can see these guys helping each other with injections and whatever else. And so it wouldn't be the tiniest bit surprised if they use the same source together, and it's they probably compared cycles and made notes on each other's cycles, and maybe even not everything. Some things would need to be different for the different body types, and especially for not everybody was competing at the same time. But I would not be the tiniest bit surprised if they were that's helping the jab, comparing cycles, doing similar amounts of gear at the same time, and especially so if they were running up to a competition. But Steve says quite properly, the referred to cycle is pre-competition. Competition would differ, the amounts would differ, stuff would be taken in, stuff would be taken out, and these guys would be working. Charles Glass is a great coach, so there'll be a lot of discussion. I believe they've all worked with nutritionists at some point as well. I can see a lot of conversation going back and forth with their buddies. I think the only thing they didn't do is they didn't live together. They pretty much did everything else. I would not be surprised in the slightest if they partied with the same women at some point or other as well. So when it comes to that kind of stuff, you have these, let's be honest, we have these conversations with buddies. We talk about what we do. It's not always discussed on the forum in that particular way, although we talk about the cycle we're going to do and we want advice. This is people sitting down, they're eating in the firehouse, they're having the food together. I guarantee those conversations are taking place amongst that close of a group, not necessarily between a lot of pros, but between this group of pros, 100%. And yeah, so I think at times Flex and Rico and Chris were probably all using the same steroids, the same amounts, etc., etc. And obviously, as they got more experience or competitive, and in fact, Flex talks about this, if they were in the same competition, it was very competitive because you're competitive in the gym, you could competitive on the stage. Maybe then those little nuances, those little secret things that they don't want the other guy to know, that's how competitive some people can get. There'll be a little bit, then you won't be sharing all the information that you might have, those little secrets that your nutritionist has given you or your guru has given you. And again, this is something Chris does now, so I would not be surprised. But the rest of the time, pre-competition, I think there's a bit of sharing of information and almost certainly helping each other out in that particular regards and whatever, Steve. Back to you.
You don't want to talk too much about your steroid use, because what happens is you'll lose repping opportunities to rep
in public.
products and
Yeah,
supplements, because the
Yeah.
supplement companies want you to
That's
pretend
different.
that you got the way you are from the supplements, not from the
Yeah.
steroids. So there's not much benefit discussing, your steroid use.
Yeah.
Because people are think, oh, it's just steroids. In reality, 95% of it is genetics, but we don't, people don't want you to know that. They want you to, buy their supplement. They want you to think it's 95% supplement, but really it's 95% genetics and 0.01% supplement.
In fact, just to address that particular point, I'm talking about private conversations amongst the fellas here. In fact, Chris actually addresses this in the documentary. He says that at one point he was sponsored by MuscleTech, and I think we're talking about a six-figure contract. There was a suggestion, which might be wrong, of something around $400,000. And towards the end of his career, it was one of those, we're not going to pay you kind of situations, and the check's not coming to come this month because you haven't done this and you haven't done that. And this is 100%. In fact, I've just seen some recent videos on this particular subject. And in fact, Dave Palumbo addresses this in a video just literally in the last couple of days. It's quite simple. I think one of those Ask Dave videos. So you sit down and go, right, why don't top professional bodybuilders talk about their cycles, and yet second tier and third tier bodybuilders do all the time? Second tier and third tier bodybuilders need the attention. They need people to be interested in what they're doing, whether it's on Instagram or on YouTube. And Rich Piana is a great example. He's a very good bodybuilder, winning, I believe, the Mr. California and placing very well as a heavyweight, but an absolute freak when he stopped competing and made a big name for himself following on with the stuff with Mutant, talking about steroids and a great deal. And Chris is quite popular. In fact, I've said this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's in their contracts. I don't care what the reporter asks, question the reporter asks. MuscleTech or whoever that's sponsoring you, giving you six figures, does not want you talking about steroids when they want you to sell supplements. They want the buyers to think the supplements is doing everything. You do not want the steroids. All your training, all the genetics. It's got to be this product. This is a product I gave you. This is why he's a champion. Not the genetics, not the training, not the dedication, not the diet, not the steroids. Then there's another thing which I've addressed in previous interviews and podcasts, etc. It's quite simple. If I make a name for myself as a world-class athlete, and I'm out there in the media, and this includes being in national papers sometimes for the Mr. Olympia. Sometimes the big competitions make the locals, they make the state paper, they make the national papers. Do I want the feds knocking on my door? Ronnie Coleman talks about having to get prescriptions and having the feds asking questions and being interviewed and all that kind of stuff in one of the podcasts that he's done. You can't become famous, even if in the bodybuilding circle, without getting attention. The last thing I want to do is have police knocking on. Well, Steve knows, I've had the police come here over confiscation of SARMs via customs, which got sent to me in a post. Now, I'm not a famous bodybuilder. Can you imagine being a famous bodybuilder and sitting here talking about your steroid cycle? You're going to get slated in the newspapers. You're going to lose money on your contracts. You're not going to get all the appearance fee. You've made a name for yourself. Some people like it, some people don't. Ask Lee Priest. But do you want the police knocking? Do you want the FBI knocking? We addressed this in a previous podcast Steve and I did when Milos had his house raided for steroids. They didn't find anything. I don't want my house getting raided. And if I'm a professional bodybuilder, I want my lifestyle nice and quiet and simple and straightforward. I want to train, I want to eat well, I want to compete. That's my vibe. I do not want to have to deal with legal issues. I don't want to have to get Rick Collins, the bodybuilding lawyer, to come in. I don't want none of that bullshit. And that's me now. I certainly don't want it as a pro bodybuilder. So we talk about these things on a podcast because we got the freedom of speech to do so. And we can take a guess. And Chris can talk about these things a little bit more now because he's not a top professional bodybuilder. And he's out there working with guys. And in fact, in a perverse way, it's actually good business for him because it shows that he has the knowledge. And when people come to him as a customer, they can, as a client, as someone who's going to work with, he can show that he knows what he's talking about. But as a professional bodybuilder, there's so many reasons. Young guys like to ask these questions. Wannabe bodybuilders and tier 2 and tier 3 guys like to talk about it because it makes them feel kind of insta famous. But the top professionals can't talk about it for so many reasons. Do you want to be stopped? Listen, Chris is a big black guy, especially back in the day. Black guys talk about being stopped by the police all the time, just having a nice car. Can you imagine having a nice car and the drugs raid? Have you got any steroids on you? We know policemen that take steroids. We know Fed guys that take steroids. This is I wouldn't want to draw that kind of attention to myself, Steve. I don't know about you. That's just, yeah. Younger guys need to get their heads around it.
Well, the other attention you don't want to bring to is the health ramifications. And we saw him we talked about episode 117 about the Flex Wheeler situation, how it got so bad. Now, in Chris's case, I mean, he almost got paralyzed. So now were steroids directly involved? Maybe not directly, but they were indirectly involved, because we've seen studies that have shown that, you know, you use anabolic steroids, you abuse anabolic steroids, it's going to have an effect on the kidneys. 90% of people who abuse steroids end up with kidney issues because of that size and because of the steroids you use.
This is two very quick good examples as relating to what Steve said. So straight away, he's been treated or perceived a particular way by the police officer, the guy that didn't want to move him. When he gets to hospital, the medical staff there are like, so what's the issue here? And it's in steroids. And then, of course, we're talking about issues with the blood tests, issues with recovery. I believe, here's a thing for you, Steve. So they had him in an induced coma post-operation, and he lost 60 pounds. He woke up and couldn't quite get his head around the fact that he was a different looking guy. There are some video clips and photographs of him learning to walk after the competition, but 60 pounds of muscle tissue. So he must have gone into hospital.
I was going to say that losing the 60 pounds saved his life. Your body is like, I don't want this muscle. I don't want this size. You got to get rid of this. And he's got so much muscle and no fat to lose that you're going to lose muscle in the process, you know? But
what about, for example, we've been asked this question, guys get injured and they're on a steroid cycle, or they get ill and are on a steroid cycle, and this is just about as ill as you can get, very much with Flex Wheeler. Having that amount of steroids in your system is not going to help you recover from the injury that you got. In this case, a spinal operation. It's not. Having your your RBC count real high, having that much testosterone in your system when you're not moving, you're, as I say, in an induced coma, laying on the bed, not physically restrained from hurting yourself, is not going to help you recover from an injury. It's not going to help you recover from an operation.
It's the inflammation from the anabolic steroids. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, literally, for example, the anaesthetist was going to have to look about how much gas and air is going to have to give him, or how many drugs is going to need to knock him out. What's his recovery like? Do they have to make adjustment for blood pressure? Is he going to bleed more? Do we have to give him more blood during the operation? What's his recovery like? They might have given him some steroids to help him recover if he was a normal guy, but here's a guy they actually want to decrease the amount of steroids in the system. So in terms of how the medical professionals, from EMC, the cop, right up to the surgeons, approaching them, are going to come in here with a negative attitude. They need to run a bunch of tests that was going to cost you more money in America, especially just to see what the hell's going on. They're going to kind of want to take some of that steroids out of your system or wait till that amount decreases. And he needed a major operation. And then, as I said, how much of an effect did it have? He lost 60 pounds of muscle. Well, lost 60 pounds, full stop. But some of that would have been muscle. And, maybe the only saving grace in terms of his athletic ability, and perhaps indeed, arguably, even the recreational drugs, with that amount of time in hospital and recovering, etc., is that his mindset to recover would have been on point. The desire to walk again, the desire to recover, the desire to get back into the gym. I mean, one of the things he actually talks about in a nice way, for all these negative things aside, is that once he was able to leave the hospital, I believe he was in the gym within a couple of days. So it's that the perverse addiction that all of us guys, hopefully listening to this podcast, have, is that need to train. And again, in terms of recovery, in terms of muscle tissue around the spine and the legs, etc., walking, maybe getting back in the gym as a form of rehab and for your mental health is a good thing. And that's maybe the one saving grace here. But yeah, You've got problems with, like we talked about earlier, on people's perceptions when you're out drinking. The same thing applies to hospital. You might be seen to look at as a really big, healthy specimen, but in reality, you're about to have a major operation on your spine that you could potentially disable you for life. And I, as a doctor, as a surgeon, and a team of medical professionals, have got to make sure that everything else is on point. And here I am dealing with all the drugs that you've taken just as a bodybuilder. So it's potentially an issue there. And indeed, I've had interviews, medical examinations or whatever else over the years, even if it's just sort of like every 5-10 years, 40 plus, 45, 50 years, so on and so forth, where they say to you, oh, have you used steroids as part of the conversation? And that's just for me. And you know that my stuff is real low level cycles, long time between cycles. It's not professional. Can you imagine being a professional bodybuilder and having to deal with some of these issues in terms of your steroid intake when you go for anything vaguely medical? One of the things, and again, Steve knows because he's in America and I'm not, thank goodness, in terms of the medical cost. If you can, one of the things we see, and this is again on the forum, we sometimes see guys on the forum talking about having the medical insurance doesn't cover it, and yet, but they'll spend $1,000 on a cycle, but they won't pay out the extra for the insurance. Equally, if you're on a cycle and you have got good medical insurance, you can end up having to pay more for these kind of situations, which, fingers crossed, it doesn't happen. But in Chris's case, did happen. I wouldn't want to be in Chris's situation. I wouldn't want to be in his shoes, being a top professional bodybuilder, having to have a spinal operation, and you're probably talking about another $100,000 out of pocket expenses, Steve, or whatever the hell's going on at that particular time. I think we didn't hear any sort of great sob stories about the money afterwards. So I think maybe his medical insurance covered it, but certainly would have.
Depends, yeah.
More.
It depends if he's part of a family plan, if he's married.
Mm.
I'm not sure if he's married. That's not talked about on here. They don't.
No, I believe he's got a kid now, but certainly as a professional bodybuilder, I don't think he was. I think he might be now. I know that he talks about the documentary, which has been shot in the last couple of years, having a son. So
yeah, but these top level bodybuilders, they usually use, there's a group of doctors that they'll use that deal with bodybuilders. So the doctors are going to know, but the problem is if you have to get rushed to the hospital, you're running into doctors you've never met before that don't know your history, don't know your anabolic steroid use. They don't understand anything about anabolic steroids. That's a nightmare situation to have to be, because a lot of hospital, you don't get a choice at the hospital that the ambulance takes you to. You don't get to choose, you know what? Can I go to this hospital? It's like 20 more minutes. Can you take me to the hospital? They're going to be like, they're going to laugh at you. They're like, no, you're going to the hospital we decide to take you to, not the hospital that you want to go. And we're not taking you by helicopter an hour to go see your regular doctor. He's going to have to drive his ass to the hospital if you want to see him.
What about the medical insurance companies? If you don't tell the medical insurance companies what you're doing, and then you have to end up with this major situation that requires proper surgery and an immense amount of time recovering, believe you and me, people, it's one of those things. If you haven't told them that you're taking certain medication, you're best to get a prescription from a doctor if you do so that you can at least have yourself covered by the insurance. Because I do not want to be in a situation of going for major surgery at hospital and then having my American insurance company, if I lived in the States, not paying out because you didn't fess up that you're using steroids or recreationals or any. It's just a stupid situation. And as I say, my understanding of the story regarding his back injury is that there was no great shakes in terms of needing the money or having to ask for money or whatever else. So we're going to assume that in his case, it was all covered. But if you're in a situation, guys, this is a bit of advice again for us. Pay the extra. Get full coverage. If you can afford to do it, or if the company you work for includes medical insurance, ask them what's included. Because otherwise, out-of-pocket expenses. And if it's out-of-pocket expenses, I've had this conversation with Steve via the forum. I've seen the numbers. It's obscene. For you go and get your hand stitched up, they'll charge you just a couple of $1,000, Steve. It's obscene, man. It's like it's a month's wages for 10, 15 minutes in ER.
You walk into a hospital, it's going to cost you a couple grand just to walk into the hospital. And if you don't pay it, they'll send you to collections. They'll bill you.
Yeah, that's
They're
what
gonna
I'm
send you
talking about.
collections. You
Lose
can't
your
get away.
fucking house.
Either pay it or we ruin your credit. You have
So imagine then, right? You're in this situation of being a top professional bodybuilder. You're doing this steroid cycle. You're making a great deal of money. I don't care if he's getting a 6-figure contract. You lose all your salary paying for the out-of-pocket expenses that's not covered by your medical insurance. So, guys, and I said this earlier a few minutes ago, I'll say it again. You don't cheap yourself out in this regards. If I had to do it, I wouldn't want to. We don't have it here in the UK, thank goodness. But if it goes that way, and who knows, it may well do. There's already some sort of conversation that we might have to pay certain, just a small fee to go and see the doctors now. This kind of stuff. You're a GP, what you call an MD. I don't ever want to be in a situation of being a top professional bodybuilder, 6-figure contract, doing what I need to do to be the top level pro that I need to be, and then my insurance company refused to pay out because I haven't got the proper coverage, or I didn't fess up, or I didn't get a doctor's permission for some of the things that I was doing. So the insurance company screws me out. And now I'm looking to lose my house, $250,000. For the kind of surgery that Chris got, I think we're talking 6-7 figures, Steve, as far as the insurance company, certainly 6 figures.
anything with having to do with kidneys like that, you're looking at least 100 grand, 125 grand. So
the upper spinal stuff, it's got to be 6 figures.
So those of you listening to this, that's another good reason not to abuse anabolic steroids, because it's not going to end well for you. It's going to come back to bite you. Gosh, I mean, I in my early 30s, I went pretty hard for a couple of years, but injuries kind of set me back, where I had to back off. It wasn't for the injuries, who knows what would have happened. Now I'm much more conservative. I take care of my body. I run blood work. I'm aware of what's going on. So, for me, I don't have to worry. But if you're abusing steroids throughout your 20s, throughout your 30s, you get into your 40s and 50s, your kidneys are taking a beating year in and year out. So you really have to be aware of that and make sure you have good coverage, and make sure it doesn't come to the point where you're going to have these kidney problems, because these organ issues are a domino effect to the rest of your body. All right, Mobster, finish up. We have 20 seconds.
Very quickly, fella, then. Something that Steve talks about all the time, the blood test. Go on the forums, check out the links in Steve's signature line underneath his post for a way of getting reduced prices on blood tests, because I've seen people that say $1,000 on a cycle, but my insurance only covers 2 blood tests a year. Pay the extra, fellas, and use the link that Steve gives you. And finally, look after yourself, whether it's N2 guard, for your liver and your kidneys and your organs, low-level cycles. And if you get injured, sort the injury out, recover, rehab, rest, and then go back in the gym. You've got the rest of your life to train. You don't have to. We don't want you having major operations. We don't want to hear 6-figure bills, and we want to keep you guys healthy and strong. Steve.
All right, guys, that sums it up. This is another episode, guys. We don't have a preview on the next one. We haven't got that yet, but we're not going to share it. We're going to keep it a secret. So you guys are going to have to just wait till the episode comes out next week. For Stevesmi and Da Mobster, this has been Evolutionary Hardcore Podcast. We will talk to you guys then. Have a good one, guys. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.
Bye-bye.